So, hello, everyone. I welcome you to our first CREES Noon lecture of the academic year.
Is this the first one?
It's the first one. Yeah. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Elizabeth King. I'm the director of the Center for East European Eurasian Studies. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Health Behavior and Health Equity over in the School of Public Health. Before we get started on today's event, I want to also take this opportunity to let you know about some of our upcoming events. Our next CREES Noon lecture series is on, event in the series is on Wednesday, September 25th. Also right here at the same time, we will be joined by Victor Martinovich, who will be doing a talk on permanently reinventing itself, Belarusian culture confronting cyclical erasure. Martinovich is an associate professor at the European Humanities University in Vilnius and is currently a Fulbright visiting professor at Hunter College. And then on Wednesday, October 2nd, CREES is co-sponsoring an event with the Center for Armenian Studies on, for us, Deserts for Bustling Cities, Early Soviet Yerevan Between Armenian Futurism and Post-Persian Retropia by David Lopald, who's a research fellow and will be here at the University of Michigan. And then also our annual Borka Tomninovich lecture will take place this year on Monday, November 4th. So it's some kind of pre-election, get your mind off of and think about something else. We'll be joined by author Alexander Hemen, who will talk about migration and narration. And that's an evening event starting at 5:30 up on the 10th floor of Weiser Hall. But you can also, if you're not already subscribed to the CREES listserv, you're welcome to leave your contact information and you will get this and a series of emails about other events that we have planned here at CREES and are also co-sponsoring with other centers and departments. I would also like to mention that our neighbors, the Center for Copernicus Polish Studies, will be hosting their annual Copernicus lecture where Rafał Trzaskowski, who was the mayor of Warsaw, will be giving a talk, Poland, New Hope for Europe. And that will take place on September 19th at 5:30 up on the 10th floor. Well, but today we are joined by Terrell Jermaine Starr, who's the host and founder of Black Diplomats YouTube, for his talk on reporting from Ukraine as a Black independent war correspondent. As I mentioned, you're our kickoff event for the season for the CREES Noon lecture series. Terrell is host and founder of Black Diplomats YouTube, where he publishes weekly feature-length videos of his travel, documenting life in wartime Ukraine, and his reports on interviewing people of color across Europe. Terrell was a Peace Corps volunteer in Georgia from 2003 to 2005 and a Fulbright Fellow in Ukraine from 2009 to 2010. Terrell holds an MA in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies and an MS in News-Editorial Journalism, both from the University of Illinois. He also earned a BA from Philander Smith College, a historically Black college in Little Rock, Arkansas. Today's talk, he's going to focus on his reporting over the last few years in Ukraine, and kind of especially talking about his use of social media, coupled with the willingness to break traditional reporting norms attracted to every major media outlet in the world. So we've seen you on MSNBC, CNN, BBC, and many other places, and we're super excited to have you here with us in Ann Arbor for this noon lecture. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and then hopefully you'll leave some time for Q&A.
I'll leave a lot of time for Q&A. Yeah.
Thank you.
How's everybody doing? All right, this is going to be interactive. I won't take all the time. I won't lecture and drone to you, so we'll be plenty of time for Q&A. I am really happy to be here. I want to thank the Center for inviting me and the Wallace House as well. And the European Eurasian Center, I believe that's also another sponsor too as well. I hope I'm pronouncing the title correctly. But I want to thank everyone else who took the time to co-sponsor this event. So by the way, I grew up down the road in Detroit, Michigan. I grew up on the west side of Detroit, and child of the 1980s. So I'm local-ish You think so, right? And and so I want to talk to you all about how I got into this part of the world, because the elephant in the room that a lot of people aren't comfortable as, how does this Black dude that grew up on the west side of Detroit find himself covering the war in Ukraine, right? I'm going to get straight to that, and most importantly, talk about how that actually enriches the type of stories that I tell, and how at the end of the day, I want you to get just a few main things from what I say. I want you all to have a healthy appreciation for what it means to have a non-traditional approach to your own profession. You all come from a wide range of schools and backgrounds, and I don't want you all to be afraid of breaking the mold, because the only way that I was able to reach the people that I was able to reach through my journalism was that I did not take the traditional path of storytelling and journalism, right? I leaned into my Black experience. I leaned into my knowledge, so that I could reach as wide an audience as possible. I also want you to think about what this Russian invasion has done to Ukraine, as far as making us all challenge how we view Russia, how we think about Russia's colonial past and its colonial present, and really help us to interrogate what a lot of Ukrainians and people from Central Asia, particularly Uzbekistan, where I spend a great deal of time, how they view Russianness. So much of how I view, and I say Russianness because in America, we have this term of interrogating whiteness. And over in this part of the world where we devote our time, people outside of the Russian context, the Central Asians, the Baltic countries, the Caucasus, for example, they all talk to me about Russianness. And I'm bringing this to you because the reason why I tell the stories differently than everyone else is because as I travel across this area that we know as the former Soviet Union, people interact with me differently. And it doesn't mean negatively, it's just they speak to me from the context of, you're Black, you will understand how we're treated. You understand? So when I'm in the Caucasus in the Caucasus, for example, people will say, well, Terrell, in Russia, we're treated like Black people. We're Black in Russia. Now, mind you, when I first went to Georgia when I was 21 years old, I never, I'm looking at these people, obviously like, okay, you're white. Okay. Right. When I go to Uzbekistan, I'm a Muslim. Right. Because I have conversations with Uzbeks who talk about what it's like to be a taxi driver in Moscow. You understand us. Or I'm in Ukraine, where you conventionally in America, Ukrainians are white, but they have their own colonial history with Russia. So in all of just being a human being in my body, traveling across this region, people have a different type of engagement with me than they do with my white peers. And that opens me up to a different side of these people's lives that a lot of folks who don't look like me don't get an insight into, because I build an interpersonal relationship that's based on a shared struggle. And my whole presentation to you today is how this Black dude that grew up down the road in Detroit found a shared struggle with people from Central Asia and generally people who would be considered white, right? And how my understanding of race expanded as a result of traveling in this part of the world and just simply existing, because that informs the journalism. But before I do that, I want you to immediately go take out your phones, because I'm an independent journalist. Go to Black Diplomats official YouTube and subscribe. I do really great content, okay? If you're an independent, you're an entrepreneur, you're gonna push your product, okay? So I just started this channel and doing a lot of great stuff. And it's all about wartime Ukraine and elsewhere. So yes, let's start there. So when the war started, I was actually in Ukraine to start a tourism business. Interestingly enough, right? I was an independent journalist. I left my job at the Root, which is a major major news publication for particularly leaning towards Black American audiences. They were bought out by a private equity firm, and we know what happens when you go down that route in journalism, right? So I left in October of 2021, moved to Ukraine. And at that moment, there were talks about Russia invading. No one believed it, including myself, until it happened. And so I want to first spend the first 10 minutes talking about basically what it was like leading up to the war and how I decided to make my difference there in reporting. So I had no institutional support. I wasn't even filing stories. I was living off my savings in Ukraine. I was a Fulbright grantee in the country. And so I had my own contacts, my own friendship networks. And so that's how pretty much I was able to navigate the beginning days of the war. And so leading up into October, not October, but February of 2022, I just started tweeting, and this was pre-Elon Musk's Twitter, by the way, about my experiences and just giving an on-the-ground perspective, just using my phone. And I didn't have a camcorder, any type of fancy equipment. All I had was this phone, but I was getting hundreds of thousands of views on my video. And people like this kind of micro reporting, 2 to 3 minutes of, okay, this is what a scene in the street looks like. This is what it looks like on a Friday night. People are drawn to it. And the reason being is that when we think about a country that's about to go to war or in the middle of a war, we just think about tanks and missiles and gutted out buildings. And so just giving people insight into what this country looked like was something that drew people in. And again, they were also fascinated by the fact that this Black dude was there, right? And I'll get more into that later, why that's kind of a difference maker. And so I immediately needed to decide what type of stories am I going to tell? And the stories that I decided to tell weren't the ones that would be on CNN or MSNBC, which ironically I was on, right? I decided to talk about how this war was impacting my friends and the conversations that I was having. And so, quite frankly, the Ukrainians, my friends, were talking about the fears of being displaced out of their homes. But more specifically, we were having conversations about the speeches that Putin was making about not invading Ukraine until he eventually did. And the one thing that I noticed is that American media will play snippets of Putin's speeches. For those of us who understand Russian to any faculty, you know that you can go to any Russian news site, you can hear the whole thing where he talks for 15 to 20 minutes. And the way that Putin talks about Ukrainians, just when you listen to him communicate, the best way, Putin, the propagandists on Russian state television, to me, they pretty much talk about Ukrainians as their culture doesn't exist. I mean, Putin literally says that there is no such thing as a Ukraine. He says that. But then if you listen to the propaganda speak about Ukraine, which are pretty much networks that are approved by the Kremlin, they talk about Ukrainians like they're white trash. Very humiliating, very degrading terms. There are slurs that are used to describe Ukrainians that are regularly used by propagandists across Russian television, which I won't name. And so having this context, I decided that I would frame this on major networks by saying, by talking about how Putin uses very derogatory language that we as, like, if it were reversed here in the United States, we would say that it's a form of discrimination. So it wasn't an issue. So I framed my storytelling not only as one of a territorial conflict, I framed it as an existential conversation that Ukrainians feel about themselves. So this is about their identity. This is about their existence. And that began to have some resonance. And from a from a television standpoint, that gained resonance, but also in a kind of academic-wide conversation, I found that there are a lot of people who are kind of resistant to looking at Russia through colony and looking at Russia through the lens of imperialism and colonialism. And primarily that is due to the fact that the way that this field has been structured over the years, it centers the Russian perspective, and it kind of subjugates the Ukrainian perspective, the Central Asian perspective, the Buryat perspective, the Baltic perspective to a ghettoized type of lens. Basically, these are, they're not as important as the people who study Moscow. So there's a hierarchy of importance that voices are positioned in this field. And what I did was I amplified the Ukrainian voice because as a Black journalist, who just not only as a Black person, but as a Black journalist who's covered Black people, I know how it feels to not have my voice centered because there is a more dominant voice in America. The white voice was centered. What Ukrainians were telling me was that the Russian voice was centered. The audiences in America may not understand the regional conflicts. They understand race, they understand discrimination, and they understand difference. My job was to use my academic experience to frame my storytelling and to frame what the Ukrainians were telling me in an accurate way, right? That reflects the realities of their region, while also communicating that in a way that my audience will understand. Y'all with me? Good. All right. So, let me see. So basically, this is one of so slowly but surely, I started getting picked up even by local networks, including my various local channels around Detroit, and so let me see here. Okay, that's it. Okay, and I don't know. Are any of you journalists here? Okay, good. I want to tell you what it's like to cover a war. By the way, no one can tell you how to do that shit. It's really insane, right? So basically, when I first started covering the war, I was embedded with with my buddy's volunteer unit. Let's skip right here. And so basically, he was one of the many men that said, okay, I'm going to take one of the rifles that the government gives out, and I'm going to go fight for my country. And so this vest I have right here is what the guys in the unit gave me. I didn't have my own vest, right? And so the first thing that they asked me was, oh, you didn't leave, you're still here. And so they embraced me as one of their own. And so we're standing next to to this can. We're in Brovary. For those who are familiar with the Kyiv region, they know where Brovary is. And so they just had cooked some shashlik in this can earlier. And so I pretty much slept with them every night, et cetera, covering checkpoints. And so what I would do is each day, media would ask to interview me, mind you. And so I would take the phone, have a selfie stick, and I would report what it's like to be with these volunteer soldiers. And that was the spot news. What really compelled them was, why did I care? And that gave me an opportunity to talk about how Ukraine impacted me personally. And what was really troubling when the war started was that I woke up every morning to my friends calling their family members, their wives, their sisters, their brothers, their mothers, their fathers in their hometowns that the Russians had occupied. And they were trying to get through, and sometimes they can get through and sometimes they couldn't. And so a little precursor to this was that when the war started, my buddy Andre, who you'll see shortly, we decided that we would move into his house, because if we had to flee together, it would be easier to go together as opposed to going from one person's house to the next, to the next, to the next. And so every morning when I woke up, my Ukrainian friends would be on the phone calling their families. And it sounds simple, but those were some of the most heartbreaking stories, because they didn't know if their family was dead or alive. And so I brought that feeling and that emotion and that uncertainty into into my stories when I was on when I would be picked up by major news outlets. And so what it did for them was it brought a very deep personal narrative as an American who was listening to it. And it was an American that was reporting this story in a way that the average American can feel it, because they know, an American knows what it feels like, or any person knows what it feels like when you can't contact someone that you love. And those were the stories I had access to. You know, I didn't have the security detail that you could pay $5,000 a day to go to the East and have the armored vehicle. The only thing that I had, and I joke about this to this day, the best that they gave me, my street skills, my street knowledge and smarts of growing up in Detroit, my education, and Black Jesus. That's all I had, right? And language skills, all those things helped me tremendously. And so I had access to people who I woke up to every morning, and each day we would listen on the radio and on television to Russian state television, talk about Ukrainians. And one of the broadcasts, and I can't recall the network or the person who said it, but I remember the words really, really distinctly. They said that we're going to, that one of the terms were, we're going to free this country of all its Nazis. We're going to eradicate, and it starts with a H, it starts with a H, and it's a really derogatory term that you use to describe Ukrainians. That's described in Russian. And also, we heard messages from Putin where he argued that this Ukraine is a made-up land, it's a made-up territory with made-up people. And so, it's not his words that are particularly newsworthy, because we know this is how he feels, right? But if you're in a country that's currently being invaded by what we understood to be the second most powerful military in the world, right? And you wake up to these messages of people just constantly beating up who you are as a human being every single day, every single day, every single day. This is what you wake up to. And when I would tell American audiences via CNN, via BBC, I would ask, how does it feel when someone targets you for being who you are? And you get that message every single day. And the messages reminded me of some of the conversations that I had with my Black grandparents about the types of racial slurs and the types of negative stereotypes that they heard about themselves in their own media growing up. That resonated with people really powerfully. And the reason why I bring this up to you is that one of the things I had to learn is that growing up as a Black young man in Detroit, I thought about my own issues of discrimination, of dealing with discrimination and racism and what we know as white supremacy, et cetera. And I lived in my own world, right? And it took me to live in Uzbekistan and Ukraine and Georgia to really understand that people who are considered white or people who aren't Black have a similar story in their own context. And what I saw was a great opportunity for us to have a better understanding of how can we fight these systems of oppression together. That's what I really wanted people to take away from my reporting. I don't feel good when people treat me, when people use my race or redline my community. I don't like it when racist urban planning is used to disenfranchise me. I said that the redlining and the racist urban planning that informed much of my life and that of my parents is not that big of a stretch to compare it to the colonial enterprise of Russia. And so, as I continue, as this reporting went on, by the way, this is me with some of the soldiers. And before I make my next point, for you, those of you who may consider war reporting, you see this guy right here. He has good trigger discipline. Some people don't. And one of these soldiers, I believe, ironically, it was him. He almost shot my foot off. So just be mindful of that. If you do this type of stuff, you have this type of dark humor that comes about. But anyway, what you see across here, this is the grandfather, this is his son, and then this is the grandson. So you have multiple generations that were fighting together. And each day, you know, they were all sharing stories to me about the future that they wanted for their children and for themselves. And so at the beginning days of the war, there was something about viewing me describing these stories through a cell phone that was a vastly different viewer experience from even a camcorder or a major or a large sophisticated camera that a network would go in with. So I gave people almost like a voyeuristic sounds a bit. I would say I gave them like the mobile phone experience that most of us understand, right? And I think that with that cell phone, because we all have a relationship with our phone, we were able to actually, people felt connected to it personally. So long story short, with this, what happened was that the Russian, this site was a part of a missile strike, and I was about 100 meters away when this strike happened. This is not in this photo, but the long story short was that the strike, they hit our location, 4 people were killed, and these guys were not trained for that type of combat. And so my buddy Andre, who's right here, we decided to, he said, okay, I can't be with this unit anymore, so we're going to help families to leave. That went into another story about how my Blackness ironically was connected to it, right? I would be on television and they would see me, they see this Black dude taking these white families out of the country. And on Twitter, a funny narrative took place. So I went from one family to the next, and they said Terrell is actually conducting the Underground Railroad in Ukraine. Needs helping people lead to freedom. And so it all went back to this whole thing of this Black dude over there, because it is unusual. And so and it was unusual because I was there on my own dime and not connected to a network. So that brought even more of a novelty to it. And so basically, this is us going to the border. And this woman here, her name is Irina. She's a translator. She is a friend of mine, and she worked at the language school where I took Russian and now Ukrainian. And so I started covering what it was like to go through checkpoints and getting from Kyiv to, let's say, Poland or Slovakia. And this woman, her story was a sad one that turned positive. She was in the hospital dealing with cancer treatment, and the hospital where she was located politely asked her to leave because they had so many soldiers that were injured, and they said, we basically don't have any space for you. You need more room for our fighters. Can you please find another place? Mind you, this woman is dealing with a serious form of cancer. And so I went to my social media and said, can y'all help us to get to we're trying to find a hospital that would take her. So I was documenting my story, and what was happening was that the Ukrainian diaspora, everyone from around the world was DMing me and saying, if you get her if on your journey, if you need a place to stay, if you get to this town, you can stay here. And so, mind you, Booking.com, Airbnb, that was done. So I literally had on my trips that would take 3 days or 4 days. This one took 4 days to get from Kyiv to the Polish border. I depended on my Twitter and people DMing me saying that they can post me. And so if it wasn't for social media, that would have been a really rocky journey. And so with her story, it turned out positive because a person DM'd me on Twitter saying that if you get her to this bus in Lviv, then we could take her to Lithuania and then we'll take care of her cancer treatment. And so prior to Elon Musk's taking over Twitter, this was actually a pretty valuable platform. And then what was also happening was that the people in the Twitter newsroom said that you're a trusted source. And so they amplified my tweets to the top of their algorithms. So in a time, and not only that, they trusted me to help verify other people on the ground when the blue check actually mattered. And so I was able to help verify roughly 100 people because they looked at me to say, well, who's a voice that we can trust and who can't we trust? And so there were some people who I actually reported for spreading Russian propaganda and disinformation. And so, let's see here. So basically, with this war, with this war that's actually 2.5 years in, I really, at the end of the day, I wanted us to take an opportunity to reframe how we view oppression. And as somebody who has worked in Black media for a majority of my career, I spent all my time talking about racial injustice with Black people, Black Lives Matter, et cetera. And so I took that same reporting, I reframed it using my regional knowledge and looked at Ukraine from a perspective of, this is a story of oppression. It's a story of resilience, right? Because no one thought that the Ukrainians would stand up, but my storytelling was so personal and direct to it because I felt like I connected with the Ukrainian people. And one of the main messages, I would say the main message I want you all to leave with is I want us all to challenge ourselves to connect, to try to understand people that we traditionally don't think that we would connect to. And I want us to challenge our own biases and our own stereotypes and go beyond our own concept of what discrimination looks like, go beyond our own concepts of what oppression is supposed to look like. And I felt like I did a public service for Ukraine by doing that, because the conventional, traditional style of reporting would have never explained Ukraine in this way. And I think that's vitally important now because people were talking about the war elements of it, what was the military, from a military perspective. But because Ukraine, looking at the time, I'll be done in about 10 minutes, but because Ukraine is a country that was never centered from an academic standpoint, even from a reporting standpoint, prior to the war, most journalists who would talk about Ukraine took a week trip, if that, from Moscow. And I truly think that one of the main reasons why Putin overestimated his capacity to win in Ukraine, and why why many in the West underestimated Ukraine, is because they functionally don't understand this country. So much of how I think Ukraine's defense posture is set up, it has a lot to do with culture. And we tend to look at cultural studies as, again, that kind of soft, insignificant type of field when compared to economics or when compared to politics. But Ukrainians were fighting fiercely because they wanted to protect and safeguard their culture. And I think that's something that all of us in one way, shape, or other can relate to. And another parallel that I was drawing was during the first revolution in Ukraine, 2014. There are two things that happened that actually added some texture to my reporting in 2022 and beyond. In 2014, two major events happened. It was the killing of Mike Brown, and there was the Orange Revolution.
Euromaidan. 2014. It's number 2, actually.
Thank you. Okay. Euromaidan, absolutely. Euromaidan. And then it was the killing of Mike Brown. Why are these subjects similar? For one, both of these uprisings challenged the media to reconsider how they covered them. With Ukraine, it was just simple as saying, you know, we're not KIEB, we are KYIB, right? It was Ukrainians using social media to document their uprising and eventually them getting rid of Viktor Yanukovych, right? And so in Ferguson, you had the same thing with Black activists using cell phones, right, to tell their story and taking control. So 2014 was a year where Ukrainians, activists, and civil society, and Black American civil society used digital media and their cell phones to tell their own stories. And so that was a major challenge to American mainstream media from an international standpoint and a domestic one. And so there are lessons that we can all take from that when oppressed people utilize the tools that they have in order to tell their own stories. And so that's another point. And so now I'm in Ukraine right now, and I have my own YouTube channel. I told you, Black Diplomats Official. And by the way, why is the name Black Diplomats? Real simple. If Black people, or you can even say other people of color, were to tell these types of stories, what stories would we pull out? What stories would we pull out of Ukraine and elsewhere, and how would we tell them? So this story, which I just published, is about a couple who took a plot of land in Kyiv in the Podil district that was rented by the Russian embassy back in 2015. The Russians decided they were going to build embassies there, and they said, well, we don't like this, and we're just going to go and seize this land like they seized Crimea and Luhansk and Donbass. And I just randomly found out about this story when I was in Kyiv this summer, and they were like, okay, this couple did, took this land and turned it into a park. And so before they turned it into a park, it was basically a dump. And so they converted it into a park. And so this thumbnail, we just took it, to me is a story of Ukrainians saying that if we can't take the land that's occupied by Russian soldiers, we can at least take territory where there are no soldiers at all. And so it's a resistance story. It's one of them claiming agency. And so I did that one because it resonates with the type of story that I would tell here in the United States. And so it's a story about talking about Ukrainian agency. And this story here about feeding the elderly during the war, again, I found out about this story on my social media. Someone's suggesting me to write about it. And when I was covering the story, the short version of it is that this war, inflation has gone up significantly in Ukraine, and these pensioners make about $130 in their pensions per month. And so the simple part of it was that I found a couple that was taking food to these elderly people. But a part of that storytelling was that these elderly people who are 80, 90 years old, they lived through World War II, and they lived through the Soviet era. And so they were all telling me about how oppressive it was in the Soviet Union, right? And then they feel like, and so it's a re-traumatization for them over and over again. And so that's embedded in these types of stories. Let me see, I'll go back. So now, going back to my current reporting. By the way, this is Irina's, her cancer is in remission. And so she went to Vilnius for about 6 months. She recovered and she's back, and she's actually helping me to translate from English to Ukrainian. And so this is a story that I'm shooting, and obviously I have a better camera now. Okay, I moved up a little bit. So basically, this is an Afro-Ukrainian woman who is from Donetsk, and she had to leave because her city was again occupied by Russia. And so the importance of me being a Black journalist is I do these types of stories, and I know that being independent, it gives me the flexibility to tell stories that you don't see on the major networks. And so, how much more would we learn about Ukraine if we told stories from people like this? And so her story is going to come out in the next few months on my YouTube channel. And this is Alina again. And so basically this woman here, she's from Luhansk. And the short version of her story is that she's a bodybuilder. At 36 years old, she said, I don't like my body and I'm going to lift weights and get into shape. And she became a European champion. She was born in Luhansk. Her mother is currently living under Russian occupation. Her two brothers were tortured when the Russian military came in. They were tortured by soldiers, and they decided they were going to fight. And one of them was killed. And her other brother is currently in France dealing with mental health issues connected to his service. So this is a story that I'm currently working on right now. This is her daughter, by the way. And the daughter that motivated her to go work out and become a European lightweight champion. And so her story is one where she had to flee Luhansk in 2014. And all of her life possessions were lost because not only did she have to flee, but her house was bombed. And again, this is a part of Ukraine that a lot of people don't know about. And that's what I do in my current reporting. And so what I want to leave you all with before we get into the Q&A is I am passionate about Ukraine because I feel like this is a ministry for me. It's something that I feel like I was built to do. And I've spent my own money traveling to this part of the world. because I feel like there's stories, even beyond the war, that needs to be told. And there's so many stories that haven't been told that don't really fully explain the complexity of what Ukraine really is. And I feel it's my duty, it's my personal passion to tell those stories. I want you all to look inside yourselves and think, how do you use your education to make us better understand each other and to live in a better community with one another? That's what I really want for all of us. And a brief story kind of top it off is the first time I traveled to a non-Black country, it was Russia. And summer before my senior year, on the application that eventually posted me to go to Russia, it asks you, if we select you to go on this program, we'll pay for it. Where would you like to go? I chose all the Black places. When I got the letter back, it said, when the acceptance letter said Russia. I don't want to go to Russia. And it took some nerve because the program was free. This is back in the summer of 2001. Called my godmother, and this is before I knew anything about the country at all. And my godmother basically admonished me. She's like, your mother Black, your daddy's Black. And so what she went through was this whole conversation about your whole life has existed in this Black kind of bubble, and you need to expand and do something else. And so when I'm encouraging you all to, I don't know where you are in your own personal journeys, but in order for me to tell the story of Ukraine with the dignity and respecting the open-mindedness that it required, I had to open my own mind. I had to expand my own way of thinking. And so I think the major problem with a lot of journalism is that it's not self-reflective. And most importantly, the way that I tell the story of Ukraine, I center Ukrainians. I go to Ukraine. I live in Ukraine. I travel around the country of Ukraine. I don't report about Ukraine from the perspective of somebody who lives in Moscow. And that's the difference. And I lean into my identity as well. And I never thought that I would, as a Black American, somebody who grew up on the west side of Detroit, would personally connect deeply to Ukraine. But once I opened my mind and I wasn't afraid of leaning into the stories that I'm supposed to tell, you know, once I leaned into my story, once I leaned into myself, I was able to produce the best type of stories that explain Ukraine in ways that I think advanced not only just better information about Ukraine, but I think it was a better development and moving the field forward. And so that's what I want to lead you with today. Lean into yourself so that you can not only be a better person to yourself, but demonstrate respect to the people who you all in one way or another in your international careers are going to be centering in your work. And I'm really happy that you gave me an opportunity to talk about my work about Ukraine, but also it's a growth story. And I think that Ukraine deserves agency. It deserves to be centered in its agency. It deserves to be centered. They need to be positioned to tell their stories. And you don't have to be a part of that group in order to be an ally, in order to be a supporter of that. And I want you to be allies in wherever life you are too. And so I want to take your questions now. I want to thank you for being patient with me. You got a good 30 minutes, right? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So you're welcome to ask questions. All I ask is that when you do ask the questions, if you just briefly state your name and your affiliation or something, so you can know. And we have a overflow room, those at the left of class moment to join us, but there might be some questions from there. So
That's cool.
Jump in a second if they start coming in. Thank you.
Let's go first. Go ahead.
So this is about, my name is Isabel. I'm a first-year master's student in the CREES program. Would you mind talking a little bit about your experiences in Uzbekistan? I got back from Uzbekistan about a month ago on a language program. I'm curious what your experience was.
All right, so I go to Uzbekistan pretty much every year. I stay about a month. So I traveled to pretty much every part of it. So I'm just not in Tashkent. Uzbekistan is not Ukraine, I'll tell you that much. I love one of the things I enjoyed about it was the first country I was in that was predominantly Muslim. When I say it's not Ukraine, it's not a dig. It's just that the governments are different, and politically the governments are different. Therefore, I move differently. Not only in Uzbekistan, but Central Asia in general, right? So that's what I mean by saying it's not Ukraine. And so I'll tell you about the cultural, just my interpersonal dynamics. Now moving to the political briefly. So when I first went to Uzbekistan, I was interested enough a host of the Uzbek government, the tourism department did host me, right? So I guess this does go to the political first and personal second, right? So I was advised by a number of people who traveled to Uzbekistan to have the Uzbeks to kind of know me first. It was, and by the way, I paid for my own trip and everything like that. When I got on the ground, the tourism department took me around, right? Because there's this whole thing of, we're going to open up to the rest of the world, right? So one thing that really was interesting was like the top level Uzbek hospitality. And it was literally on steroids. I've never been treated nicer in my life. I just marvel at how kind, and it felt uncomfortable that they were so kind to me, and I felt extremely safe. So the first impressions were, when I first went, and this is even beyond the hosting part, once you got beyond the officialdom of it all, people, were greeting me in a traditional, Islamic greeting because of the beard. We thought, okay, well, you're Muslim, right? I'm not Baptist, but I kept the Muslim thing going without actually saying it because, it helped me to connect with people. It was, I felt like I was being sold to this idea that we're a free country and that everyone has rights and everything. It's not true. But I went there in part because Langston Hughes, one of my favorite writers, traveled to Uzbekistan. And I wanted to visit some of the places that he visited in Uzbekistan. That's the reason why I went. Now, once you get beyond the political part, where I really grew to appreciate Uzbekistan, once I got away from the government officials and I started going on my own, was even though it was a predominantly Muslim country and I'm Christian, I felt I went to the continent of Africa when I was 19, and when I went to Uzbekistan, it felt similar because they were welcoming me there, like, hey, brother, how you doing? Brother this, brother that. And so, whereas in Ukraine or a country that's not a POC country, I didn't get that type of experience. I was, so it was that type of dynamic going on, especially being a Black American. And then too, I was also interested in Uzbekistan's relationship with Russia, which is a lot more complex than people get credit for. Example being that I would say after my third trip of going there, the Uzbeks started opening up to me about how they felt about politics, et cetera. And what I also noticed when I would go to the museums, I understood like their own relationship with Russian colonialism. Like I went to a museum in the Fergana Valley, and it was a small little kind of boutique spot. And the curator was taking me from one exhibit to the next. And what he was explaining to me was that so many Uzbeks were sent to fight in World War II that were completely disproportionate to their numbers, right? And so basically he was saying that we were just, we were treated like I forgot the term he used. But basically, he was saying like we were like the throwaway people. And so he was like, they just literally sent us away like dogs. And again, I felt like when I was having those type of conversations, I honestly feel like there's a different, he was explaining this to me because I was Black, honestly. Like, it could be false, but I felt that way because I kept having one conversation after the next, after the next, after the next. So it helped me to expand my understanding of Russian colonialism, but it also helped me to understand the Uzbeks being Uzbeks, right? Because unfortunately, you know, there are a lot of stereotypes about Central Asia, right? You know, the Stans, right? And there's a lack of intellectual sophistication that comes when people talk about Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Kazakhstan. I found it to be one of the best cross-cultural experiences I ever had in my life, and I go every single year. I encourage more people to go to understand Uzbekistan, because I just feel like there's just a severe lack of not just regional knowledge on the ground knowledge about the country. I love. I'm sorry for being kind of generic, but I love the country very much, and I'm pretty sure if we were to talk separately, I can give you more specific details. But yeah. Oh,
I am Holger Roneman. I'm a Lightwaters Fellow. I investigate journalist from Estonia. I wanted to.
Oh yeah, you did.
I wanted to ask him in connection to the debate yesterday as well.
Yeah.
Trump twice failed to give an answer to the question if he wants Ukraine to.
Yeah, I saw it.
Harris at the same time was trying to present herself as a commander-in-chief, talking about leadership in NATO, and etc. At the same time, in Ukraine, there is a growing frustration with Biden administration. But like, what about the view from the lower level, not the governmental or presidential level in Ukraine, but from the society about the American elections and the impact on the fate of the country?
Yeah, okay, so fundamentally, they're just surprised that Trump is even a serious candidate, right? So that's the main thing. People ask me, Terrell, how could this happen? And I say, you don't know America. So that's the main thing, right? Again, just being a Black person, I get to talk about America in ways that they're not used to. And Trump does not shock anybody who understands America. And usually, when I talk to people, it can be just at the common level, governmental level, but the people who were surprised included folks who went to study at Columbia University, Georgetown University, University of Michigan, right, elsewhere. And I find that a lot of people who come from the Baltics, from Ukraine, et cetera, they come here and they stay in a particular type of bubble. If you're here, if you're in Michigan, you should go to Detroit and hang with Black people, right? You need to, because you'll get a better understanding of Detroit, of America, Midwest town, which is the largest Black city in the United States of America, right? If you're in Washington, D.C., you need to go to the Southeast. If you're in Chicago, you need to go to the South Side. And people are shocked by Trump because they're shocked that America is really in this condition. They had this idea that Martin Luther King marched, and so we're all free. And I just tell them in my own personal life, that's just absolutely false. And so my conversations with the vast majority of my Ukrainian friends is just breaking this myth. Because many of these people, my friends, they're even diplomats. And I tell people this all the time: if you don't understand race, you know nothing about America. And I have to break it to people. Very few people who specialize in this part of the world, they know nothing about America. And I can't completely blame them because a lot of the white people that they, professionals and colleagues that they interact with, don't tell them any better. So I can't completely blame them. So they haven't gotten over the shock that someone like him could get to the top of the ticket. I'll finally say this. The reason why and I'm now down this hill, Ukrainians, the reason why they were not able to get, why there was a big holdup on that last military aid package, was that they were victims indirectly of American white supremacy. Let me explain why. Really simple. America first, this argument is used to stereotype crime in Chicago. The Mexicans are coming across the border and they're raping everybody. And the Haitians are eating dogs. We're used to taking this, right? At the center of this hatred, of this white supremacist a mantra of Donald Trump and many of the GOP, is that they speak to white Americans who feel like their whiteness is being valued. And anything that goes elsewhere is supposed to be meant for them. It doesn't matter that the Ukrainians or Baltics or whoever look like them. You're the other. And so this billions of dollars that's going to Ukraine is supposed to make my life better. And the Ukrainians were locked into the Mexicans are coming over and they're committing, they're raping and pillaging the Haitians and the Black people. They were locked in indirectly with everyone else. Because the thing about anti-Blackness and hatred, it's a boomerang. It comes around and it impacts everybody, including white people. If you don't take anything from what I say, even just think about it. You will see this country in a whole different way. And all the questions that you have about why Ukraine is still this way, it will all be revealed to you if you understand how race works. It invariably screws everybody. Oh, it was up to you, bro.
My name is Martin. I come from Slovakia. I'm a research fellow here. And you mentioned Slovakia as well, that you used to go there with
The refugees, yeah.
Refugees. I prefer to call them friends rather than refugees. I've never been very comfortable with this.
Okay.
Actually, and what do you think is the role of Russian propaganda in Central Europe nowadays? Because we can see that mood is significantly changing. In Slovakia and Hungary, for example.
Yeah, Slovakia, yeah.
And then you can look at the Czech Republic as well, slightly, and there are going to be elections there quite soon.
Mm-hmm.
So, in my opinion, it seems to me that it is this pseudo-nationalism and Russian propaganda that's been fueling this anti-Ukrainism maybe in the region.
Yeah.
And what you said that it should go to us, not to Ukraine. It's the same rhetorics used in Central Europe by nationalists.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think Russia is behind that, based on your experience?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I mean, it's not just my experience; it's proven. It's proven that's the case. I mean, but succinctly, I would say that the thing about white supremacists, they understand that across Europe, especially, one thing that we have in common is our whiteness. And I explained to you earlier, right, that the way that from Eastern Europe, like this, right, the way that a person from Slovakia, Ukraine, or Poland is viewed is vastly different from Eastern Europe. And we know that when the European Union accepted new members and how Eastern Europeans are considered to help. You know this better than me. Okay, and so even race in its own, like in Europe, the Eastern European is the other in many respects, right? And so, ironically, the thing about Russia, what they understand, they didn't create racism; they do a damn good job of exploiting it. Okay, well, Russia does have its own form of racism and colonialism. It's a whole different lecture, but they know how to exploit, and they can. And the Europeans and Americans are very slow in responding to it. And the best way that you deal with this is that we all need to have a coming to Jesus moment. All of us, about like the whites, exactly. People who embrace this stuff is have a coming to Jesus moment about why their whiteness or their their sense of being devalued can be preyed upon so easily. What's going on in Slovakia, what's going on in Germany, right? What's going on in Germany, what's going on across Europe is no different here. There was a New York Times article that was written in 2016 after the end of the election, where some white person was asked about Russian interference. And they said, so long as Hillary lost, I'm all for it. So these are people who would rather see their country fall and be under the influence of a foreign state, at least from a disinformation standpoint. They would have that because at the end of the day, they see their whiteness as being devalued and someone is honoring it, ironically, under this false sense of, we're going to help you take your country back. It can be described differently in Slovak language, but that's the whole narrative. It's always blame the immigrant, blame someone else. It comes out of an old playbook that's very effective. And I think that's the leaders of these individual countries, and it's their civil society just as important, that's going to have to really take control of it. Now, ironically, this has not taken hold in Ukraine. That's the biggest irony for a country that's full of Nazis. This is a country where less than 1.5% of their parliament is controlled by the far right. They've never been able to have a hold on power. It's just an interesting thought, and I hope that helped. Go ahead.
Ethan, I'm also with the CREES master's student, and I was just kind of wondering, have you ever had any interactions with like Russian media as you're working in Ukraine? Like, they tried to discredit you or something like that, and like we faced kind of repercussions for that?
The Russian embassy in Washington trolled me on social media several times. I just tell them to go fuck off, and they yeah, but no, I haven't had any interaction. Now, ironically, I'll tell you something. I think it's the first time you're admitting it on, in a public forum, is that in 2014, I was on RT. And here's the thing, I worked briefly for this progressive kind of left-wing site, which, by the way, the Russians do a really good job of targeting progressive left-wing outlets. And I was talking about Black Lives Matter, like the protest of Mike Brown, right? And so I didn't understand it then, but what they were doing, and it wasn't even anything anti-Ukrainian or anything like that, right? It was more about talking about how bad America is in race. And I always remember trying to add some context and nuance to what I was saying, but the person that was interviewing me was trying to take me in a particular way, right? Now, of course, it didn't take me long, like, okay, I shouldn't have done this interview, stupid, right? But whatever. So I had maybe 2 interviews with them on something Black Lives Matter specific, but to your larger question, afterwards, it was the Russian embassy that then was like, they had a tweet of some Black person, some Black female basketball player that was playing in Russia, and her last name was Starr. And my last name is Starr. And they're like, this is a real star, not this Terrell Starr guy, just stupid, petty crap, right? And they would do stuff like that, but it was nothing particularly serious like some of my other colleagues. Like, yeah.
My name is Joseph, and I'm retired, but still involved. And you were in Georgia at an exciting time.
There's a couple of exciting times. Which one?
And I would like to hear something about your impression of the country and people.
Briefly, okay. So when I went to Georgia, again, many of my time, my experience was really, it frames up really simply. I realized that they were the real Caucasians, and we had a big joke about that. And it was my first time understanding that whiteness, as I understood it, was a bit incomplete. And one, some of the best food that you'll ever have. Absolutely top notch. I was happy I was able to experience Georgia as a Peace Corps volunteer and not as a partisan government entity, because I was able to roam freely, etc. Georgian language, which I can speak, has nothing to do with any Slavic language at all. I was really impressed culturally with their European aspirations. Because it's one of those countries that's kind of, they're geopolitically in a really terrible spot. Like they're surrounded by Azerbaijan, Armenia, they have Turkey, and then they have Russia at the top, right? Georgians say we're literally stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Because they're this place that is more European green places. But what I got from Georgia is that, again, they have their own relationship with Russia. And me personally, I always had this type of relationship where people would approach me and say, Chimo Miko Bonobo, it's like my brother, right? Chimo Miko, it's kind of more like a slangy way of saying, hey, bro, what's going on? And it was really my intro to understanding ethnicity in the country. So I had this kind of CREES or REES education. And then when I got on the ground, it gave me like that interpersonal context where they gave me this sense of connectedness that enriched my experience in ways that did my other colleagues. I'm supposed to go to Georgia in the next month to cover the parliamentary elections. And I'll briefly talk about, that is a air silent alert. So there's literally some missiles or drones being fired at Ukraine right now. So that's what that is. So Saakashvili was a managerial genius. He was also batshit crazy. And his ego got the hold of him, which has led to his demise in a wide range of ways. And I won't delve into that. Georgian people, I have found to be some of the most resilient people that I've known. I think it's a great place for people to go and study. I would encourage this program to encourage others to study Georgian language, to visit the country. And yeah, I have nothing but positive things to say about the country of Georgia. And obviously I cover the politics particularly carefully, but those are my insights. Yeah.
I think my name is Joseph Swanky. I'm a Knight Wallace Fellow and also a distinguished fellow at the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia.
Yeah.
I've lived and worked in Ukraine for 20 years. And yeah, I think your analysis and commentary in Ukraine is really spot on. And I also think you bringing up, Russian colonialism and imperialism is highly important, especially in an academic setting like this, because these ideas are fairly new outside of Ukraine. Ukrainians have been dealing with this, talking about it more and more over the past couple of decades. It's only gotten kind of outside of Ukraine more recently. So it's great that you're bringing this up. And I'm sure you know what I'm about to say. You probably just kind of forgot to bring it up, but I think it's also important to highlight the war didn't start in 2022. It actually started in 2014.
Yeah, of course.
No. I just want to make sure people in the room hear this. And up to that point, the 8 years of that first war, or the war leading up to the full-scale invasion, like 14,000 people already were killed just at that point.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure that kind of gets set so people hear it.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, the basis of this, I feel like, is kind of the comparison between American people of color and non-Russian Slavs or people in post-Russian imperial spaces. And I'm just wondering how the relationships between people, non-Russians in post-imperial spaces kind of problematizes that, because I feel like there are a lot of people who don't solely have the identity of an oppressed person. I think Ukrainians are an example of that, right? You can look at World War II, where Ukrainians took advantage of the geopolitical situation of Eastern Europe and killed 700,000 Polish people. Or you can look at the example of the Georgians, who have, a sort of fraught history of relations with their neighbors in the Caucasus, that, in some ways is vaguely imperial or is attached to Russian imperialism. And in the same way,
That's true. Yeah.
the basis of, Ukrainian support in this war has been the United States, who, the government of which was largely responsible for, the racial state of affairs that we're currently dealing with and have been dealing with for 300 years, and is also responsible for,
What's the last part? Who's responsible?
Well, I think you would probably agree to a certain extent that the American government has a role in systemic racism in the United States.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Right.
Not a role. I mean, they're the main thing. Yeah.
But,
I'm saying, yeah, correct.
So,
Yeah.
they're the system, and they're also supporting colonial efforts in other parts of the world. And so.
Yeah, America is supporting colonial. Yeah,
I'm just wondering exactly like what your reading of the role of the country in the world is, what you think sort of like, how you think these factors.
What country, by the way? What country? Like America?
Yeah, like how does the United States' status as another imperial power kind of complicate our ability to help?
It doesn't complicate. It's what it is. Like, I mean, we need to call a thing a thing.
Sure.
I don't think it's complicated. I think you have to acknowledge it. Look,
Well, I guess my question is really, can you call this a decolonial effort? Or can you call it?
I get it. Yeah. So look, yes, I'll call it a decolonial effort. Why? Because two things can be true at the same time, right?
Sure.
The thing about NATO, because they're doing it primarily through NATO, one, I think that America is definitely, as a colonial past, colonial present, not only colonial, but imperial, right? When you think about IDF, et cetera, like all those things are absolutely true. We only have Haiti and other countries that are considered third world to look at as examples, right? But going back to your point of Ukraine, I think that it can also be true that Ukraine, because we have to center Ukraine. Ukraine took the agency. Ukraine, Poland, and elsewhere saying that we want to decide our own defense architecture, and we don't want it to be that under the rule of Moscow, right? And so, and in one sense, I've had other people ask me, one, what's NATO's role in somehow, provoking Russia, which I think is a bullshit thing, but I'll get into it. But basically, I think it's okay for us to deal with more than one problem at once. I am all, for example, I'm somebody who's big on having a nuclear-free world. I am someone who believes that I believe that and I won't get into it because for a wide range of reasons, but I've been to the West Bank. I think it's apartheid. I'm not going to argue with anybody about it. That's what it is, okay? In South Africa and all other oppressed, I'm all for it, right? I think that I can rightfully have a legitimate conversation about America's aiding and abetting of Benjamin Netanyahu, also talk about the rise of anti-Semitism in this country, and also give Ukrainians agency to choose their defensive posture and their movement. And I don't think that it complicates our, acknowledging that America has an imperial president. I just think that we need to deal with both issues at the same time. What makes it difficult, to go into your other point, what makes it difficult to rally international support around Ukraine is American hypocrisy in our foreign policy, right? So I spend a lot of time talking with my African colleagues, and that kind of Africa's policy towards Ukraine is a lot more complex. If people say, I could do a whole lecture on that, but the point of it is that there are a lot of people who say, why would I go behind and support France? And they haven't given us reparations, right? Why would I go behind and support a country like France or Belgium when they haven't acknowledged the genocide in Congo, right? So you want us to rally behind Ukraine and you're giving them all this aid and you haven't given us anything. I agree with, so it complicates it in that respect, right? It absolutely, so I stand correct. It does complicate it when you look at it like that, right? But it's not complicated to acknowledge it, which is my point, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But the problem is that we don't want to acknowledge it, right? And that's actually got me into a lot of trouble online and elsewhere. And just for students, thank you for asking this question. It'll be my last one because I know we have to go, but I want you all to know this, right? When you decide to be morally consistent, you're going to pay for it. let me just be very direct with you. You're going to pay for it, okay? When you decide to be morally consistent, you will pay for it. There are a number of, I'm pretty sure, just off the top of my head, there are a number of fellowships I've applied for, won't get it because what I said about Palestine, right? And it's a mind fuck for a lot of people. How can you, Terrell, we followed you for Ukraine. How dare you say all these things, right? And I tell people that, look, if my main point to you all, in order for us to grow, we have to think beyond what we know. How do we treat each other with respect and dignity? That requires us to call a thing a thing. That requires me to challenge my government when I see moral inconsistencies and voice it, just as I am about Ukraine. I don't think that we need to dismiss Ukrainians because they're the white people and they're getting more help than everyone else. I think that's wrong. I also respect the people on the continent of Africa and the Middle East who are saying, what the, you know what?
Right.
And that's not an intellectual position, that's a moral one. And I want you all, regardless of what you all are that you take away from this, I want you to have a strong moral foundation, because I want you all to wake up in the morning and look at yourselves and not regret the decision that you make as professionals later in life to say, I could have done this or I could have done that. And that's what I'm navigating every single day. And so I'm happy that you asked that question on the ending note. It's an important one. I want you to keep asking that. And I'm going to tell you that you're right. It complicates our relationships. And how do we not complicate it? By treating everyone with equality and respect. That's going to be a lot harder for all of you than you all realize as you go into professions where your paychecks depend on you following the line. I hope that you all make the right decisions and as you pursue it. I want to thank you all so very much. Yeah.